Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our 2020 session in the General Assembly. This afternoon, we want to provide for you an overview of our budget, the 2020 budget session budget overview, amendments to the FY 2018-20 budget, and also the proposed FY 2020-22 budget. We thank you for being here. I want to ask you to join me in welcoming our Director of our Appropriations Committee staff, Ms. Ann Oman. And to all of the staff that's present, thank you all so very much for being here and for all of your due diligence. And we're going to turn it over to Ms. Oman to lead us in our meeting.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. I will be starting off the presentation today with the overview. If we can find out from folks what we need to do to get the screen switched over. Looking first at the economic assumptions in both the caboose bill and the big budget, you'll see that Governor Northam's budget proposals are based on the IHS Economics October Economic Outlook. This is the outside group that the Department of Taxation hires to do some estimates on national economic outlook for them, and these are then adjusted to reflect recommendations made by the Governor's Advisory Commission on Revenue Estimates. That's the group made up of both business leaders across the Commonwealth as well as legislative leadership. Overall, you'll find that the growth rates for the current fiscal year are slightly softer than what was expected a year ago. And Virginia will continue to slightly underperform the nation overall. But the fears of an imminent recession that you were hearing last summer have fallen off, and most economists are not expecting one in calendar year 2020. But for a multitude of reasons, the very long length of the current economic expansion, the longest in U.S. history, as well as the very low unemployment levels in Virginia, growth is expected to moderate further in the next biennium. In terms of the forecast for the current fiscal year, last session, when you left here, you assumed a growth rate of about 5% in 2020. This did include some tax policy adjustments that resulted in some one-time gains. But because the FY19 actual collections came in so much higher than anticipated, almost $800 million above forecast, after the August year-end close, the adjusted growth rate became 1.2%. That means that the dollar amount that you assumed you would collect in FY20 remained the same, but because FY19 was so much higher, you needed lower growth to get there. After the fall reforecast, the official December forecast that the governor presented on December 17th and is included in the caboose bill assumes a general fund growth of just under 2% in the current year. You can see the adjustments that were made on the bottom of the slide here. They are all generally based not on changes in economic assumptions, but what they call money in the bank. The Commonwealth is just doing better in the current fiscal year than the prior forecast would assume. You can see here where those changes are made, or you can almost see it's such a small font. But overall, you pick up an additional $178 million in the current year than was anticipated when you left here last session. Through the first 5 months of the fiscal year, though, revenues have increased 8.5%. So they're well exceeding even the revised forecast. Year-to-date strengths have been widespread. There's not a single revenue source that is underperforming the forecast right now. The daily deposits for December also looked very strong in the 7% range. So the continued strong collections in this current year do suggest that the December forecast presented could be quite conservative. The greatest impact that I think the governor expressed when he presented in December is that non-withholding payments are extremely volatile, and they're concerned that a lot of those revenues that came in last year were a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act change, and they want to ensure that there isn't a big drop-off in April and May on those sources. But I think at this point it's very likely that you'll see a mid-session reforecast in February. At that point, you'll have both the holiday shopping numbers in from the sales tax collections, as well as the fourth and final estimated payment for non-withholding. This chart just shows you a comparison of the growth rates you had assumed last year when you left session, the growth rates required to achieve the current revenue forecast that's in the caboose bill. And again, as I mentioned, the year-to-date performance through November, which puts you at 8.5%. So at this point, the revenues could shrink almost 2% for the remainder of the current year, and you would still meet the revised forecast. In terms of the funding in House Bill 29, it reflects a net appropriation reduction of $94.1 million. This is largely driven by savings in the Medicaid arena of just under $400 million total savings, but you had a forecast adjustment in the current year downwards of $211.7 million, as well as $44.4 million in health care fund revenues from 2019 that are going to be used to offset the FY20 Medicaid forecast. In terms of spending, there are 24 spending items that total just over $300 million in the caboose bill. The two largest are $197 million to the cash reserve fund. This was based on the surplus heard about last summer. This figure has been reduced by $73.8 million from the figure that had been announced in December based on a restatement of the year-end balances and a technical correction that the governor sent over. You also saw $21 million in increases in public education due to adjustments to enrollment. This just captures the additions and subtractions to the current fiscal year compared to what you assumed last year. And the net result is that you will have $563 million available at the end of the current year to flow through and help support spending in the big budget. So moving to House Bill 30, the overall growth rates assumed in the upcoming biennium are 4.5% in fiscal year 2021, 3.7% in 2022. This gives you about $2.8 billion over the biennium in additional revenues. Embedded in those figures is the continuation of the modified collar that's used to hold down non-withholding payments because of the issue of them fluctuating so dramatically. So there's 1% of revenue growth taken out of the forecast based on holding that figure lower. The economic forecast again, assumes fairly slow growth but continued expansion. Once again, it's Virginia's historically low unemployment rate, and added to that the low in-migration we're seeing. It really does limit future job growth. The forecast is more of the 0.6 and 0.4% growth in jobs in 21 and 22. There were not too many general fund tax policy changes embedded in House Bill 30, but listed here on the slide. There are a few related to the Department of Taxation with regards to an increased field audit staffing, worker misclassification audits, and changing the 1099-K reporting threshold that will bring in some additional revenues. This slide just sets out the biennial forecast in House Bill 30 for the upcoming biennium. You'll see you have total revenues of about $23.3 billion the first year and $24.2 billion the second year. While there were not any major general fund tax policy changes embedded in the budget, there are three non-general fund tax policy changes. First, there is language related to cigarette and other tobacco products, doubling of the cigarette tax from 30 cents to 60 cents, doubling of the other tobacco products, increasing that from 10 to 20%, and in combination, those two are anticipated to generate about $250 million over the biennium. There's also an assumption of $125 million from the games of skill or gray machines. That we don't have much detail yet on the level of taxation that would be required to generate those revenues, but that figure was developed to ensure they could backfill the losses that the lottery is seeing because of the competition from the games of skill. And finally, there's a proposal that will be embedded in standalone legislation related to transportation that would eliminate general fund support for debt programs and transportation. That's the Route 58, the Northern Virginia Transportation District bonds, and the Oak Grove Connector in Chesapeake. totaling $122 million. That debt service would, of course, still be paid, but it would come out of Commonwealth Transportation funds instead. In terms of the savings and spending, I'll just give a couple quick highlights. One of the questions we'd heard is how are we able to support such robust spending growth when we're seeing rather modest revenue growth? Those of you who have been on the committee have heard Secretary Lane say a number of times recently that we're facing a math problem in the long run. Revenues aren't growing as fast as our drivers. But this year you're seeing that you're able to support spending well in excess of the revenue growth in this current biennium. And the reason for that is you left the last biennium in such strong structural balance. There was about $650 million of spending in the current fiscal year that went to one-time activities, which you can spend on ongoing activities in 21 and 22. So that adds essentially 3 percentage points additional spending to the budget, which enabled them to include about $4 billion in net new spending in House Bill 30. The spending proposals in House Bill 30 would leave an unappropriated balance of $13.6 billion at the end of the biennium. This next slide lists the top 20 proposals, which make up over 85% of the spending. As is generally the case, rebenchmarking and Medicaid utilization and inflation alone make up about 45% of the total spending. Some of the other large items worth mentioning, there's $300 million in the second year to continue to add to the Revenue Reserve Fund you all created 2 years ago. And the governor has also provided $100 million each year in central appropriations that is not earmarked for any purpose, but available for uncommitted contingencies or activities the General Assembly might be interested in undertaking. I'll let staff go through these other items as they go through their presentations if there aren't any particular questions on those. In terms of savings, you don't see as many of those in the budget this year because of the structural balance they were in. You have the tobacco tax increases, which allow the general funds for Medicaid to be reduced. Similarly, the reductions in general fund support for transportation frees that up for other purposes. You are finally seeing some savings associated with VITA, with their new service provider model. There's about $103 million in savings over the biennium and $44 million of savings from the closure of the training centers. In terms of reserves, by the close of the biennium, you would have $1.9 billion, which is above the 8% of revenues, which was the initial goal, although I know those of you who are at the retreat and have heard Chairman Torian speak that there was an interest in getting something more like 10 or 11%, which was what S&P and the rating agencies had said they thought would be a healthy position for Virginia to be in to withstand a moderate recession. In terms of structural balance going forward, we're very pleased to see that because FY22 is the base year in which the next budget is developed, the spending in this budget will support core services going forward. Although you're using some carry forward monies from 21 to support 22, that is all going to one-time spending like the $300 million to the cash reserve. So you would have more than enough to cover spending going into the 23-24 biennium. With that, I will hand this over next to Susan Massert. For those of you who are new to the committee, I think many of you know her regardless. She is the Health and Human Resources Analyst for the committee, who's been with us for a very long time now.
Susan, before you begin, we have a question from Delegate Knight.
Hey, Ann. Hey. I saw you say it near the gray machines, and they said they're maybe going to try to anticipate 50 to 75 million because of the losses to the lottery. And I don't have the numbers in front of me. Maybe you don't either. But the losses to the lottery are what, in a few $100 million that we believe are attributable to these gray machines?
Those don't match the figures I have from the lottery to date. They're concerned that going forward, if the growth continues, it could come to that level. But right now, the $50 million in the first year and $75 million in the second year would be sufficient to cover their losses. Zach, who's our new K-12 analyst, has some figures on the assumptions of lottery and the gray machines in his section of the presentation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I've got some details on House Bill 29, but I'm not going to go through those because they mirror pretty much the same major issues that I'm going to cover in 30. So in House Bill 30, general fund spending in Health and Human Resources totals about $1.4 billion over the biennium. About 69% of that is driven by mandated programs, primarily your forecasts of Medicaid and your state children's health insurance programs, the DOJ settlement, behavioral health services pursuant to STEP Virginia, which are mandated by code. And then there's about $44 million for projected expenditure growth in the Children's Services Act. There's some other new spending related to relieving the pressure on the state hospital census. As you remember, they're pretty much getting close to the high 90s in their census, and so there's a number of steps in there that's proposed to alleviate that. There's also initiatives related to the implementing the federal Family First Prevention Services Act and health insurance reform, and that spending is offset by about $276 million in supplants and a little bit of savings, and I'll go through those. First of all, just to remind you about the Medicaid forecasts. Those of you that saw our retreat information will remember some of this stuff. Ann had mentioned the savings in fiscal year 20. You do have about $575 million in the new biennium related to the Medicaid forecast growth in utilization and inflation. That gets offset by adjustments to the health care fund. Ann had mentioned that the tobacco tax increase, that goes into the health care fund, and that is used to offset general fund expenditures for the Medicaid program. So in total, the adjusted Medicaid forecast over the new biennium is about $452 million. And then right underneath there, you'll see the children's health insurance programs. And sort of unusually, you'll see big forecast adjustments in the new biennium in FAMOUS, $34 and $46 million. And then the Medicaid Children's Health Insurance Program, or what we call MCHIP, that's another substantial increase. And what I will say to you is the bulk of that increase is due to federal match rate changes. You might remember with the Affordable Care Act, the federal government gave states a break on their match rates for children's health insurance program and bumped it up to from a 65% federal share to about an 88% federal share. That's now going down. We get like a year kind of in between, and then it goes back to 65% federal share again. So that's what the bulk of that is attributable to. Other DMAS spending is listed on page 26. I'm not going to go through all of these things. Most of them pertain to service expansions or new services or rate increases. Some of the large ones are the implementation of behavioral health redesign. That's an effort that they've been undertaking those last few years to try and figure out how to put in outcome-based services in behavioral health through Medicaid, and that will have some ripple effects eventually into the behavioral health service system and the Children's Services Act. There is some new things in there, like the home visiting program for pregnant women, and the rest of them are kind of standard things that you've seen. The only other one I'll point out to you is they eliminate the 40-quarter work requirement for Medicaid eligibility for legal permanent residents. That costs about $4.5 million, but that takes it back to, I think, a 5-year as opposed to a 10-year requirement. Other DMAS issues I wanted to point out to you is there is a proposal to increase the disproportionate share hospital payments by about $32.5 million non-general fund dollars each year to the private hospitals to incentivize them to take more temporary detention order admissions. We've been seeing that drop in recent years, and which has been putting pressure on the state hospitals. Now, the DISH program is a 50-50 match with the federal government. The budget before you would propose authorizing the use of the hospital provider assessment as the state match for those federal DISH funds. And then they add a position at DMAS and DBHDS to help administer that. There are some savings or some plants in DMAS and Medicaid. Ann mentioned the tobacco tax, and then some savings from the training center closures. The next item really has to do with the DOJ settlement agreement, and this is spending items that are both in the Department of Medical Assistance Services and Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. That totals gross about $65 million over the biennium, but it is offset by the savings from the training center closure. So you've got a net spending there of about $21.2 million over the biennium. The largest one is for the new waiver slots. There's 810 that are proposed in fiscal year 21 and 325 slots in fiscal year 2022. So that's the large spending item there. And we are approaching the closure of that settlement agreement. We'll finish it up in 2021, and then we'll have a year where they will monitor the state, and then hopefully we'll be let off on that agreement, and we'll be in full compliance. So we got a little ways to go still on that. In terms of behavioral health, I mentioned the STEP Virginia program. This is code mandated services. It's an attempt to really try and get a sort of a base level of a robust service arena out at the community level throughout the state. And there is, about $56 million worth of spending to try and to port out all the outpatient services. You started that this year with a down payment of about $15 million. This should bring those out in full complement through the CSBs. Peer and family support, military, and the rest of these are going to be new services that are going to be implemented in the next biennium. This gets you a long way to STEP Virginia. There are a few services that will not be funded in this budget as proposed in front of you, and they are more like case management, care coordination type services. But these are the big ticket items that really sort of move services out to the localities. In terms of other community behavioral health services, there's about $60 million in spending here, and these are largely some initiatives which the administration is hoping will alleviate the pressure on the state hospitals. $20 million for discharge assistance plans to move folks out of state mental health hospitals, especially those who are on the extraordinary barrier list that are hard to move out but are ready for discharge. Options for acute inpatient care for children, that's about $14.7. Permanent supportive housing, that'll help about 630 individuals, and that's about $8.5 million. And then you can kind of see some of the other ones there. Behavioral health facilities, there's a good amount of money here. It's almost $40 million. You might recall this past summer the governor announced that they would be funding 56 temporary beds at Catawba Hospital due to some of the overcrowding issues at the other state facilities. That was kind of couched as a way to alleviate the census problem. That really is because they didn't get the 56 beds online that they were supposed to at Western State Hospital. That's been delayed. So instead of getting 56 beds, new beds that would have been online this fall, they've opened up beds at Catawba. So those are meant to be temporary beds that would close theoretically when the Western State beds come online. But you'll notice that they put funding in the budget for both years for both of those facilities. So we'll be looking at that issue, I'm sure. They've also got funding, about $5.4 million for an additional 44.5 staff, security staff, and safety staff at the state mental health hospitals just because of the overcrowding issues. In terms of the Virginia Center for Behavioral Rehabilitation, that's our sexually violent predator facility. There's about $5.9 million to fund the operating costs in the second year of bringing that new 72-bed expansion online, about 123 positions. I will just mention to you that you had put money up. Again, they are a little bit behind schedule. You'd put money up in the current biennium for that facility. The governor's budget pulls back most of it, but left them with a little over $2 million. So we'll be looking at that as well to see what they're doing with that money. And then there's additional 12.5 positions at the Commonwealth Center for Children and Adolescents, again, to deal with problems with the admissions unit, just the overcrowding during the school years when they have problems. DSS, there's a boatload of money in DSS. The first group of money I would say goes to for mandatory services for child welfare. There's about 10.3 over the biennium to finish up this comprehensive child welfare information system. That's a requirement just because we're using some monies that we saved when the federal government took over some of our state-only adoption cases and gave us some of their federal money to help us with that. They require that we reinvest those monies in things to improve our child welfare system. And I will say that local DSS is largely running on paper out there in the field in the foster care system, so this is probably a wise investment. But we'll be looking at the details. There's about 4.6 million general fund and some non-general fund over the biennium for a mandated 5% cost of living increase for foster care and adoption. That's required by the Appropriation Act to be given in a year following a state employee pay raise. And there's some more money for adoption, foster care and adoption subsidy caseload forecast changes. It's about a little bit of money and more non-general fund from the federal government. Family First Prevention Services Act, this is a big initiative. This is a new program that the feds have put out there. For the first time, they're going to fund preventive services in child welfare at a 50-50 match rate, but we have to comply with a number of requirements in order to get there, and we have to really shift our system and re-engineer it in order to be able to qualify for the money. But there's about $50 million almost out there in local social service departments to have them establish these preventive service departments. Not a lot of detail on that I've seen so far. There's another $16.8 million general fund with matching federal for prevention services. And there's money to oversee those services in the department, about 2.2 general fund. And then there's money for a required evaluation team. They are proposing to put 20 staff in DSS, although they've indicated that if y'all want to contract for those services instead, they're open to that as well. So DSS discretionary money in the budget, there's about almost $40 million here. The biggest is a salary increase, and Michael will go over that a little bit more detail. And then there's some money in there to backfill for the transfer, the proposed transfer of the Child Care and Development Fund from the Department of Social Services to the Department of Education. There's money in licensing because licensing has to exist in both agencies. There's overhead backfills. And then there's a new licensing system that they're proposing to put in place because their old one is on its last legs. And I won't go through the rest of those unless there's questions. TANF, there's about $49 million in new TANF spending. And the largest one is really to increase the maintenance assistance payment to families who provide relative care to children to avoid a foster care placement. That's about $17 million over the biennium. And then there's a proposal to start a new summer feeding program and add about $50 a month to the electronic benefits card for that. And then there's a proposal to increase your TANF benefits by about 5%. And I won't go through the rest of them because they're a little bit dribs and drabs there, but I'd be happy to answer any question. Health Department, probably about $35 million here in proposed spending, the largest of which is to implement electronic health record system. We've been working with them in a work group over the last year to kind of get them to solidify what that request is and determine what the costs are. That will need a little bit more scrutiny this session. There's some money for a tobacco quit line, Quit Now Virginia. And again, I won't go over the dribs and drabs here. I'll be happy to answer any questions or talk to you offline if you have more. Health insurance reform, this is the last kind of big item. Sort of hits Health and Human Resources, I guess, because it's about the only place it fits. In central appropriations, there's $73 million general fund each year to fund a reinsurance program to subsidize the health insurance carriers that participate in the health benefit exchange with the intent of stabilizing rates and premiums. That would be the state share of the funding, which combined with the federal funding is supposed to subsidize premiums by about 20%. We need to probably look at that a little bit closer and see if that's exactly what it does. And then within the State Corporation Commission, there's $13.5 million in the first year and about $41.5 million in the second year to establish Virginia's health benefit exchange. So there'd be 20 additional FTEs, 30 in 2022, and it authorizes SCC to have an interest-free treasury loan to fund the startup of the exchange and repay the loan through a portion of the user fees. And that pretty much does it, Mr. Chairman. I want to turn it over to Zach Robb.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make a couple comments briefly. This is a lot of stuff, and we'll have a lot of time in HHR to go through it all. But for the audience, the mental health crisis in our hospitals has been severe. You may have heard about it. The administration's very concerned about it. When we made a policy change that if you can't find a bed in a private sector, when you're having a mental health incident, you have to go to the state hospital will take you. That has had become de facto state being the first choice rather than the last choice. At least some people say that. And we have a lot of spending in here the governor's proposing to help with that mental health crisis. The other thing I wanted to ask you, that was a statement, this is just to ask you, could you characterize for us, for the audience and the new members of the committee, why the overall big picture Medicaid spending is going up, like the aging population or the growth in children that need services, or it is based more on, correct me if I'm wrong, the number of people that are eligible than it is any more benefits that we're providing. Can you characterize the reasons for the growth?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the growth in the aged and disabled population, although it has been more incremental, their expenditures are pretty high. The cost to serve children and adults is quite lower, but we have more of them, and they tend to grow a little bit faster, like about 3% a year. So that, that does account for a large bit of the spending. It's just the growth in the people that we're serving.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Zach Robbins will be here talk about K-12.
Good afternoon. I look forward to working with each of you on your K-12 proposals this session. Starting out by reviewing the technical amendments in the caboose bill. There's approximately $46.2 million increase in K-12 spending, primarily driven by a 3,500 student increase to enrollment and projections, resulting in about a $21 million increase. Decreased lottery forecasts will require a general fund backfill of about $15.4 million. Then on the decrease side, there's about $15.4 million in savings, driven primarily by lower than expected participation in several programs, including VPI Plus, special education, regional tuition, and also 9 school divisions that did not provide the full pay increase in FY20. And this results in an overall increase to the direct aid in the caboose of about $30.8 million. Moving on to House Bill 30. Overall, the bill proposes an increase of $517.6 million in FY21 and an additional $284.4 million in FY22. That's an increase of 6.2% in spending in the first year and an additional 3.2% in the second year. I would note that the state per pupil expenditures are proposed to increase by about $550 across the biennium, coming to $7,250 in the second year. Every 2 years, the costs of public education in the Commonwealth are rebenchmarked using expenditure and staffing data from the prior 2 years as reported by local school divisions to the Department of Education. These updates are routine and technical in nature, and they're applied before any policy changes are proposed. Rebenchmarking impacts SOQ payments, which is where about 90% of state payments are directed, but other programs are impacted as well, including programs such as K-3 class size reduction and the at-risk add-on payment program. Another component of rebenchmarking is determining the cost split between the state and local school divisions. The local composite index is updated each biennium based on the ability of each locality to generate revenue to support public education. Statewide, the average cost split is 55 state and 45 local, but the LCI creates a range where the split is 20 state, 80 local in the wealthiest localities, and 80 state, 20 local in the most impoverished localities. And I would note this time there were about 40 school divisions that will see their state share increase, and about 85 school divisions that will see the state share decrease. I would note that the largest decreases are in a handful of our smaller rural school divisions. things got a little bit out of order here. So looking at the summary of proposed new general funds.
Hold up for a second. We have a question from Delegate McQueen for you.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Zach, I wanted to know, on page 40, you talked about the total decreases. Kind of explain a little bit about the lack of participation in terms of the incentive programs and then the remedial summer enrollment program, school enrollment.
Right, so some programs like K-3 class size reduction are not fully subscribed, and some school divisions end up not using all of the available funds.
Okay, and it can be only used for those particular.
Those particular programs.
And they have not. Is there anything that we're doing to encourage them to participate?
Yeah, there's a variety of reasons, whether or not a local school division can provide the match. There may be situations where there's not classrooms available, there's not physical space, for example, the K-3 class size reduction, or if you needed additional staff, there may be, school divisions may have trouble hiring staff to fulfill those programs.
Another question, Mr. Chair. So we always had dealt with this particular challenge, and so we've always dealt with this in those particular areas.
It's been
Or
a
is it
challenge.
unique this year or last year, or is it a unique?
This did not appear to be any different from prior years.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So back to the summary on proposed new spending. We see a net increase of about $1.3 billion total on K-12 spending across the biennium. Rebenchmarking accounts for about 2/3 of the new spending. That's about $850 million. Other big ticket items, which we'll get into later, include salary increases proposed for the second year, phasing in additional school counselors, as well as the early childhood and VPI enhancements. This slide shows the state-recognized salaries that came from the rebenchmarking process. This is not a minimum salary that's paid by school divisions, but rather it's the prevailing salary that's recognized by the state to calculate the per pupil payments. The prevailing salary for teachers increased by about $2,500 to $3,000 over the period, and that reflects the 5% pay increases that were provided in the previous biennium. Mr. Chair, I would note that the Department of Education's annual salary survey report was submitted to the committee yesterday, and it should be available on LIS reports shortly, and it shows that the average salaries among school divisions range from about $40,000 in far southwest Virginia to about $80,000 in some jurisdictions in Northern Virginia. Here's a breakdown of each of the cost factors from rebenchmarking. Prevailing salaries, inflation factors, non-personnel, and transportation, they account for over half of the costs, come to about $460 million. Projected enrollment increases drive about $142 million of costs, and that's about 17% of the total rebenchmarking costs. Moving on to the governor's proposed policy changes, the introduced budget includes $145 million for the state side of a 3% pay adjustment that will become effective on July 1st of 2022. School divisions will be able to access those funds if they provide a corresponding increase in either year of the biennium. Two actions are proposed to increase the number of school counselors. The first would remove budget language overriding 2019 legislation that was carried by Senator Dance and Delegate McQuinn at a cost of $42.5 million. And the second action would further increase the staffing standard to one counselor for every 250 students in the second year at a cost of about $56.7 million. For the at-risk add-on program, there's a proposed bump to the upper end of the at-risk add-on range that would increase those payments. And this would be especially targeted for the school divisions that have the highest concentrations of free lunch students. Currently, the maximum range on the at-risk add-on is 16%, and this would increase it to 25% by the second year for a total of $52.6 million. Proposed changes to the staffing standards for English learner teachers would increase that staffing standard by about 20%. for a total of $27.6 million by going to a ratio of 1 per 50 students, where it's currently at 1 per 59. There's also a proposal that would expand access for free meals to students who are currently eligible for reduced price lunches at a cost of about $10.6 million. And there's also $4.9 million proposed in hold harmless funds that would provide financial assistance for about 10 school divisions that would otherwise receive less funding in the new biennium over what they would receive in the caboose bill. The governor's budget includes a package of modifications to the Virginia Preschool Initiative. It proposes increasing the VPI per pupil amount by about 10% at each year at a cost of $28.7 million. And it also directs the Department of Education to start planning for biennial rebenchmarking of the actual cost of VPI rather than using a per pupil amount that's specified in the Appropriation Act. The proposals also include an incentive for school divisions to provide high-quality VPI classrooms where quality benchmarks are exceeded. An additional student could be added, and there's an additional 2 students to the school-wide ratio, and that would come to $13.5 million. Another incentive would encourage school divisions and private providers to implement mixed delivery of preschool at $10 million. And what that does is provide a $2,500 payment with no local match to reduce the gap between the per pupil amount provided by VPI and the costs, the market rates for private preschool providers. And then for $9 million across the 2 years, there's a pilot program proposed to expand VPI to include at-risk 3-year-olds. So more early childhood changes in the introduced budget include reducing the assumed VPI non-participation rate by about 5% at a cost of $4.6 million, permitting reallocation of VPI wait lists. Those would occur earlier in the summer as opposed to the fall, and that helps school divisions plan for classrooms in August and September rather than scrambling to establish new slots in the middle of the school year. The current Virginia Early Childhood Foundation mixed delivery program is proposed to receive an additional $17 million. That program, currently they receive $1.5 million each year. This would increase that to a total of $10 million.
Chairman, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Sippel.
Zach, could you tell us what that is, the mixed delivery program?
That is that's a program that's fully administered by the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation. It's different from the mixed delivery the mixed delivery that's provided through VPI.
Let me follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Sippel.
The mixed delivery program through VPI, could you explain that?
That program, there are slots that school divisions receive from the state for VPI slots. The bulk of them are provided in public schools. Currently, there are very few that school divisions fill using private slots where they partner with private providers. The mixed delivery through VPI, these incentives that are proposed are anticipated to increase the number of VPI mixed delivery slots that local school divisions would be directly providing.
Mr. Chairman, so it's fair to say that the administration is trying to attract the private sector to help us educate our 4-year-olds and our 3-year-olds if we go that far?
Yes, there are several. There are a few proposals here that address that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Another proposal is $8 million for the early childhood educator incentive. This would supplement the federal preschool development grant funds that are used to support recruitment and retention in our hard-to-staff preschool classrooms. And finally, a language change is proposed that would increase the maximum portion of the local match that may be provided by school divisions on an in-kind basis as opposed to cash. That would increase the maximum in-kind match from 25% to 50%. And as a whole, these early childhood proposals for direct aid come to about $98 million across the biennium. The governor's budget proposes expanding 3 programs in the educational and cultural grants area and establishing 3 new funding initiatives at a cost of about $10.7 million over the 2 years. The programs that would be expanded include Jobs for Virginia Graduates, Communities and Schools, and the GRASP program. The new initiatives include $4.5 million to support experimental learning experiences for students at 2 Richmond museums, the Black History Museum and the American Civil War Museum. And, support's also provided for the Western Virginia Public Education Consortium, and that's a coalition of about 20 school divisions in the western part of the state. And this program was established by the General Assembly in 2001 to help school divisions pool resources to address their regional needs. Moving on to the gray machines and the lottery. To offset the decreases to the lottery revenues that's been caused by the games of skill or gray machines, the introduced budget proposes generating revenue from the gray machines. Annual revenues from the lottery are expected to decrease about $6.5 million over the biennium. And when looking at the lottery and the proposed taxation on the gray machines together, this would result in about $68.5 million in additional revenue for year-over-year growth in the 5 to 6% range, as opposed to the flat growth on the lottery revenue that's shown here. This table shows how the lottery and the gray machine revenues would impact the supplemental per pupil lottery payments that are provided to school divisions. The General Assembly has a longstanding goal to return 40% of lottery revenues to school divisions on a per pupil basis while reserving the remainder for lottery-supported K-12 categorical and incentive programs. Without these additional gray machine revenues, the per pupil payments would decrease to about 30% of the total lottery revenues. The proposed per pupil gray machine payments would continue to get at that 40% goal. So when we look at this, instead of a decrease in lottery per pupil payments that would occur without taxation on the gray machines, from $367 this year to $288 in FY22, that's a loss of $80. The offsetting gray machine proposal would increase the per pupil supplements that school divisions receive by about $30 through FY22, from $367 to $394 by the second year. And on the Department of Education's central office proposals, about $17.6 million in new spending is proposed across the 2 years. The major component of this is the Virginia LEAP program, and that would establish an online platform for a statewide learning management system to support virtual coursework and open education resources, to allow school divisions to share resources and curriculum among teachers across school division boundaries. And this proposal also includes 11 full-time positions to support that program. $1.4 million would support cloud data migration, and another proposal would replace the agency's outdated grant management system, Omega, and that would address some longstanding audit findings that the department has been addressing. And there are also a few early childhood proposals that fit into the DOE central office budget. The major component of that is the transfer of the $181 million in child care development grant funds, transferring that from the Department of Social Services in the second year, along with 150 full-time equivalents. And this is part of the governor's proposal to consolidate early childhood and child care governance under the Department of Education from the Department of Social Services. Mr. Chairman, this concludes the K-12 overview, and now I will hand it off to Tony Maggio, who will address the higher ed proposals.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. In higher education, there's about $288 million in new funding for the colleges and the universities. About half of this is the new G3 program in the community colleges, about $145 million. The details of this are still being worked out. We've been several meetings, and we're trying to get more detail on you, and probably in subcommittee we'll go into this in much more detail. $44 million of base operating support at George Mason and Old Dominion. There's about $45.4 million for undergraduate financial aid, and this is distributed using Chev's new financial aid approach, which is focused more on expected family contribution as opposed to remaining need. And then there's about $53.8 million in various institution initiatives. I've listed the three major ones at the bottom, but there are a handful across the system. On the next page, it's just a distribution of the financial aid and operating dollars by institution, just that you can look at a glance and see where each of the institutions are with that. The tuition assistance grant program, there's $6 million, $3 million each year, with the goal of increasing the award from $3,400 to $4,000. Now, the $3 million that's provided each year really only gets the award from $3,400 to about $3,550, about a $150 increase. The remainder, the way that they fund the program, is by eliminating tag grants for those students identified as online and distance education. The impact on this is pretty significant across several institutions. 35% of the students at Bluefield, 37% at Liberty and Regent, about 30% at Mary Baldwin, and then smaller percentages at Hampton, 2%, and 1% at Wesleyan. It's also going to impact Averett, just not sure about to what extent because we don't have data for them yet. The real interesting part about it, though, is that the tag recipients at the above institutions, 70% of them are either low or middle income students. So it's going to impact the very students that we're trying to help move through the system. And it's something that we think we want to talk about a little bit more in subcommittee. Other higher education actions is about $30 million for the tech talent. This would fund the pool necessary for what we're doing with the Amazon program. $8 million for the workforce credential, bringing the program now to about $35 million. There's $1.5 million for the survivors program because of growth in the program. There's a continuation of the Hampton Roads Biomedical Research Consortium at a cost of $8 million. $6.5 million for Jefferson Labs, $5 million of which is to compete for the federal grant. Good news and bad news. The bad news is Brookhaven got the award. It was announced today. The good news is there's $5 million of savings there. $8.6 million for the Commission for the Arts to increase the art grants. This gets it to about $8.1 million annually and begins to achieve the $1 per resident goal that's been in the budget. I'll turn it over to Michael J. for transportation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Moving on to transportation on slide 60. The introduced budget for transportation includes a $1.8 billion proposed increase in the first year, or 22% growth compared to the base, and $1.4 billion, or 18% in the second year compared to the base. A significant portion of this increase is related to legislation, an omnibus transportation bill, which was under development. It actually has dropped now. It's House Bill 1414 by the Speaker. And the budget assumes revenues of $234 million in the first year and $303 million in the second year from this legislation. There is a significant savings of general fund in the budget related to the support for the Route 58 and two other projects that it supplants the general fund support for transportation with transportation trust fund revenues. The omnibus legislation, again, assumed $234 million the first year and $303 million the second year, though it is our understanding that the bill is different than what was assumed in the introduced budget and that those revenues will be likely lower. What the bill does is it switches it to a excise tax, and it will increase it by 4 cents per year for the next 3 years and then index it to inflation. It will reduce the base vehicle registration fees. It will establish a new road usage fee based for fuel economy. It will eliminate the annual inspection requirement, and it will assume additional revenues for public transit. For VDOT, outside of that legislation, there was a $1.3 billion increase the first year and $929 million the second year, primarily from an adjustment to reflect the current 6-year financial plan. There is amendments for the Department of Rail and Public Transportation. The first one is a technical amendment that transfers money that they've been doing administratively for the last few years. It transfers money from VDOT to DRPT for $128 million that is earmarked for the WMATA Capital Fund. There is additional $31.8 million each year in dedicated funds for WMATA. This is tied to an increase in the transit occupancy fee, which is supposed to be part of the omnibus legislation. In addition to that, there's $50 million each year earmarked for mass transit funds. The second year, it's just to replace funds that have been expired, that we've been spending it already, but it was the funding source is being expired, so therefore this would replace that. For the Department of Motor Vehicles, the proposed budget gives 100 additional FTEs both in the current year in House Bill 29 and in the first year in House Bill 30, and then reduces it to 40 FTEs in fiscal year 22 for the increased workload related to the Federal Real ID Act requirements. The assumption is that the agency will be able to reduce the increased FTEs from 100 to 40 through basically attrition, people resigning instead of having to do any layoffs to get back down to the lower FTE count by 2022. Lastly, for the Ports Authority, there is a slight increase for basically payments in lieu of taxes for the host cities, and there's a request of $1.7 million the first year and $4.5 million the second year for increased lease payments at the big facility. For the Commercial Flight Authority at Wallops Island, there is a request of $7.5 million, $2.5 million to build a new hangar, and $5 million for additional support facilities at the launch site. I'll give it to Dave now.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Knight.
Delegate Austin, Mr. Chairman. We just look alike.
Delegate Austin, I'm sorry, sir.
They would say he's better looking, but not true. Michael, speak a little bit, if you would, please, about the Route 58 funds. I know the funds were taken out of the general fund and put into the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, but are they still specifically allocated for the 58 project, or did it go into competition with the other funds through the Commonwealth Transportation Fund?
Again, I don't.
Or can you answer that?
I can't answer. First of all, I'm just starting to do transportation, and we got the bill. We got the bill this morning.
Yeah, Delegate Austin, those
Yes,
are
ma'am.
still specifically earmarked for Route 58 because that does go to debt service. And so, since there's outstanding debt, obviously the Commonwealth's first commitment is to pay down that debt. So it's just a swap in the debt service source for the Route 58 bonds. But
Okay,
the intention is for that to continue, the existing debt to be paid, and the next project, which I believe is Lover's Leap, would move forward on schedule as well, and is included in Treasury's debt capacity model.
So the
right now.
process would continue forward?
Correct.
Okay, thank you very kindly. Thank you, Michael.
Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Sickles.
Question for Ann. So do you think this is a significant, would provide a significant reduction for smart scale projects if we do this? And what was their motivation?
I think the overriding motivation was to fund transportation only from non-general fund sources, to eliminate all general funds, because that was all that was left in terms of what are technically general funds and transportation. Although you all have dedicated sales tax to transportation, it comes in as a non-general fund because it was dedicated for that purpose from the start. So that was the intention. In terms of whether it would impact smart scale, I think the administration viewed it as being tied in with the omnibus legislation, and therefore there would be offsetting increases that would more than account for the debt service that will now be borne by the Transportation Trust Fund, which has always been the backstop for those recordation tax revenues for Route 58 and NBTD.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure everybody will be happy to hear I'm the start of the back nine of this afternoon's presentation. starting with natural resources, the introduced budget includes some substantial investments related to the Commonwealth's WIP 3 requirements. Just under $89 million over the biennium has been proposed for the Water Quality Improvement Fund. That's $47 million the first year in required deposits, as well as just about $42 million the second year as a supplemental deposit. And the intent here is to provide a stable funding base for ag BMPs, as well as consistent support for the soil and water conservation districts. And there, as you can see here, just about $75 million of this is flowing to the NRCF. There's stable funding for technical assistance. And in addition to this, there's a Part 2 amendment that's proposed $120 million in bond proceeds for nutrient removal grants for local wastewater treatment plants. For dam safety, there's $10 million in general funds each year into the Safety, Prevention, and Protection Assistance Fund. This is a substantial increase by comparison. Last year, $832,000 was provided for this purpose. Also in Part 2, there's $20 million in bond proceeds proposed for dam repairs for soil and water conservation districts, as well as some additional staffing to support the programming at DCR. For land conservation, there's a substantial increase for VLCF, up to $20 million a year. This is $15.5 million above what was provided in last year's budget. As far as battlefields and farmland preservation, these have been level funded in the introduced budget. For DCR, there's funding each year for maintenance and maintenance staff, as well as preventive maintenance projects that fall under the maintenance reserve threshold. There's just over $500,000 each year to operate Green Pastures Recreation Area as an extension of Douthit. There's an increase in non-general fund support for state park signage. Perhaps most substantially, there's just over $141 million in Part 2 proposals related to the park system for things such as new park construction, as well as new cabin construction, as well as renovation of existing cabins. And that'll be something for the Capital Committee to take up in its work this year. For DEQ, the governor's proposed fairly substantial investments for staffing, support, and equipment for its water, air, and land permitting programs. It's just over $26 million over the biennium. It's also just under $3 million each year and 18 positions to improve communications and environmental justice outreach. The language prohibiting joining RGGI has been removed. In Part 2, $182 million in bonds has been proposed for the Stormwater Local Assistance Funds. This is to help local governments. And there's also a $65 million proposal for bond support for Alexandria's CSO project, and this is in addition to the $20 million that was provided in last year's budget. Other natural resources agencies, in DHR, there's just over $5 million over the biennium for museum activities in Alexandria, Charlottesville, and Richmond. $300,000 over the biennium for new markers, as well as repair for the Virginia African American History Trail. There is additional support for historical African American cemeteries and grave sites, as well as the elimination of the appropriation for the Daughters of the Confederacy. In VMRC, there's $4 million proposed each year for oyster replenishment and restoration activities. This is in addition to a $10 million Part 2 amendment that would accelerate oyster reef restoration efforts, and that's to support WIP 3. Moving on to Ag and Forestry and VDACs, there's just about $1 million over the biennium to support their industrial hemp activities. In forestry, there's $1 million over the biennium to establish a hardwood forest habitat program. The existing RT program is currently limited to pine forests. There are also some positions there to help support their WIP 3 activities, as well as a proposal to use $5 million from the Forest Mitigation Acquisition Fund to establish a new state forest in Charlotte County. Moving on to public safety. For DOC, the largest item is about $27 million over the biennium to support increased Hep C treatment costs. The department has changed its testing protocols and will now test all inmates at intake as well as at release. This will have the impact of increasing the number of inmates treated quite substantially by the end of the biennium. There are amounts included for overall medical inflation, as well as with new resources and carry forwards, just about $39 million being provided for the department to begin procuring an EHR system. Also in DOC, there's just over $13 million over the biennium to provide targeted salary increase for correctional officers. $6 million each year has been proposed for VCU and UVA to operate pilot medical programs in 2 DOC facilities. And as you can see at the bottom here, there are smaller amounts proposed for several other initiatives. In state police, the largest proposal is about $6.5 million over the biennium, and that would convert 43 civilian sex offender registry positions to trooper positions. And as part of this proposal, the registry and firearms units would be a combined operation going forward. There are amounts provided to support various firearms and background check legislation that will be considered this session. The proposed budget does remove language prohibiting the procurement or implementation of body-worn cameras that was added last session. However, it doesn't, the bill as introduced has not recognized the potential costs of implementation by state police and various other state agencies. In DCJS, there's $2.3 million a year to expand pretrial and probation services, $1.5 million each year to help localities address hate crime vulnerabilities, $2.8 million over the biennium for local gun violence intervention programs, $1 million each year to increase support for PAPIS, $150,000 in one-time grants for youth and gang violence prevention initiatives, as well as $100,000 each year to set up a training program for law enforcement related to extreme risk legislation. And ABC, both the caboose and the big bill, include amendments and proposals bringing up the agency's profit transfers over Chapter 854. As far as new spending, there is just under $11 million over the biennium related to new store openings, $3.1 million over the biennium associated with the agency's move to its new facility in Hanover, funding to support the conversion of wage employees to full-time employees, support for licensing reform legislation that has been introduced, as well as $1 million in the second year for ABC to pilot its Store of the Future program. For sheriffs and jails, there is a targeted salary increase for regional jail officers that mirrors what was included in 2018 for local jail officers. There's funding to annualize the cost of operating the Prince William Manassas Detention Center's expansion. And there's just over $2 million over the biennium for additional staffing for deputy sheriff's offices. This would be about 25% of the need identified by the compensation board. Other public safety agencies, VDEM, there's some IT funding that's been included. Forensic Science has gotten additional support for the cost of maintaining its lab equipment. Parole Board has several items. So it's additional investigators for its pardons workload, as well as positions to help assist the board in its investigations and assessments of eligibility for compassionate release, as well as medical release. Legislation which will be considered this session would address those policies and change them, which was a recommendation of JLARC in its 2018 study of DOC's inmate healthcare costs. For the judiciary, there's $4.6 million a year for the criminal fund. There's also funding for 30 additional deputy district court clerk positions each year, and funding for a new general district court judgeship in Fairfax. For IDC, there is just over $9.5 million over the biennium to increase staffing support at existing public defenders' offices, as well as $3.5 million each year to establish a new public defender's office in Prince William County, which would be the first time that a new office has been open since 2005. There's also funding to annualize the cost of paralegal positions, which were added last session. For veterans, there's $5 million in one-time funding for Fairfax to support construction of the National Museum of the U.S. Army, a non-general fund appropriation to allow the DVS to get the new Veterans Care Centers up and running, as well as several smaller recommendations totaling $2.4 million over the biennium. If there are no questions, next up is Kimberly McKay.
Thank you. Now for an overview of commerce and trade. In the caboose budget, it adds about $7 million to the Housing Trust Fund, which is at the Department of Housing and Community Development. This doubles the fund from its current appropriation in Chapter 854. It also includes language authorizing the transfer of $10 million to the Commonwealth Development Opportunity Fund related to the sale of CIT's building. This increase, if taken, would increase the fund to $29.8 million in FY20. Moving on to House Bill 30, in the area of economic development incentive payments, the introduced budget provides an increase of $3.5 million in each year for the Governor's Motion Picture Opportunity Fund. This is more than doubling the size of the fund from its appropriation in Chapter 854. It also provides an increase of $2 million in each year for the Virginia Jobs Investment Program. Related to economic development, special economic development projects that are housed within this account in the budget, HB 30 proposes funding for 3 new projects recommended by the MEI Commission. These projects are related to the announcements of Merck, Volvo, and Morgan Olson. Legislation will be tied to these funding amounts for consideration during this session. These projects, when taken together, represent about $10.7 million in funding over the biennium. In the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, proposals include $4.7 million in the second year for its Talent Accelerator Program, and then an additional $5 million over the biennium for the Business Ready Site Program. The introduced budget also removes language related to use of the Business Ready Site Program funding. The removal of the language reverts back to the code's direction that funds can only be used for projects 100 acres or greater. And it also removes language, a reimbursement policy for privately owned sites where business-ready site funds are used. In the Department of Housing and Community Development, there are two major initiatives to point out to you. House Bill 30 adds $56 million over the biennium for the Housing Trust Fund, bringing the fund to $70 million over the 2-year period from the $14 million authorized in Chapter 854. The second item here to note is it adds $32 million over the biennium for the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative, which, as you know, addresses broadband in unserved areas of the Commonwealth. This, again, brings the fund to $70 million over the biennium from the $23 million appropriated in Chapter 854. Major action taken in the introduced budget. It proposes the Virginia Innovation Partnership Authority, which would be a new authority. It would be the successor to the Center for Innovative Technology and the Virginia Research Investment Committee. Legislation will be considered this session to codify the new entity. Overall, in the introduced budget, there's $36.9 million in the first year and $42.1 million in the second year. So the proposed funding in the introduced budget for the new authority includes transfers from other agencies as well as funding for new initiatives. Transferred in the budget includes 5 funding sources for a total base of about $46.7 million. The introduced budget also includes a transfer of $550,000 to DHCD for broadband activities related to CIT. So all the broadband functions would be housed at the Department of Housing and Community Development. So taking all that into account, for a base budget, you're left with $46.2 million for the new authority. HB 30 of the existing initiatives moving into the new authority, most remain at level funding, and some are actually improved over the new biennium. But as you can see from this slide, the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative has a proposed reduction of $25 million over the biennium. The remaining funding, the remaining resources moving over to the new authority are not explicitly outlined in the budget language in the introduced budget. The amounts shown here are suggestions that we've received through conversations with the governor's office. The legislation that will be considered this session includes the creation of 2 new funds, the Commonwealth Commercialization Fund. This would be the successor fund to the Commonwealth Research Commercialization Fund and the Virginia Investment Fund. As we move through the budget process, the committee will need to address these areas. Rounding out, the Department of Labor and Industry, their budget includes $3 million over the biennium to fund 12 underfunded compliance, safety, and health officer positions. In the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy, the introduced budget includes $300,000 in each year to create an Office of Offshore Wind. Also includes one-time funding to create a revolving loan fund to incentivize private investment in renewable energy projects. And in capital outlay, there is $4 million in bond proceeds for improvement to the Portsmouth Marine Terminal in anticipation of growth in the offshore wind industry. At the Department of Small Business and Supplier Diversity, in the proposed budget, there is $800,000 in each year to support a unit that will recruit SWAM business participation on the Commonwealth's large dollar contracts. In the Virginia Tourism Authority, as a reminder, there's an additional proposed investment of $7 million over the biennium in the Commonwealth's Motion Picture Opportunity Fund, which the authority manages. And now we're done with commerce and trade, and we're going to move to general government. So in the area of general government, starting out with general fund actions in the administration secretariat in the comp board area, in total, there's about $7.2 million over the biennium to fund underfunded underfunded and unfunded positions in treasurer's offices, Commonwealth's attorneys' offices, and commissioners of the revenue. In the Department of Elections and HB 29, the caboose bill, it includes $5.9 million from central appropriations as a reimbursement for the cost of presidential primary expenses. In HB 30, there's an action taken that brings the reimbursement rate to 100% for the salaries of general registrars, directors of election, and electoral board members, and would cost about $5 million over the biennium.
Mr. Chairman.
Sickles.
Yeah, thank you. Kim, we're going to get $12 million from the feds, I think, under the new HAVA that was appropriated by Congress recently. Has the administration talked to you about how to spend that money?
They have not talked to me about how to spend that money, no, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Non-general fund actions in the administration secretariat. In the secretary's office, the HB 30 includes $4.9 million over the biennium for work underway by the chief data officer. In Department of General Services, you have about $6.1 million over the biennium for the department to execute security upgrades to state buildings. And the Finance Secretariat in the Department of Taxation, general fund actions include, and taken together, these two separate actions would result about in $12.9 million of additional revenue over the biennium for the Commonwealth. These two actions are adding field office staffing for the Northern Virginia region and continuing to build a worker misclassification team at the Department of Taxation. In the executive offices, general fund actions include $1.2 million over the biennium to establish an office of the Chief Diversity Officer, and another $1.2 million over the biennium for the Office of the Chief Workforce Advisor. Of note, this action would allow the current WIOA funds, which is the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, to be used to support, that are being used to support the office currently, to go towards programming activities for the workforce system. There it is. In the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office, the proposed budget includes $1.1 million over the biennium and 3 positions for staffing in the Secretary's office. This action represents a 26% increase over the base budget. Last slide. In central accounts, two major things to point out here. As you're all aware, there's $200 million over the biennium in uncommitted contingencies in the central accounts in the introduced budget. And there is $102.8 million in general fund savings for the cost of IT services based on projections from VITA. And with that, I'm turning it back over to Michael J.
Good afternoon again. Moving to compensation and retirement. The introduced budget funds 100% of the board certified VRS retirement rates. This includes the assumption that the long-term rate of return will be 6.75%. As you recall, the last few years, the assumed rate of return had been 7%, and the board approved a reduction in this past fall. If it had not approved the reduction, actually the rates would have gone down for the upcoming biennium, and there would be a savings in the budget, but instead there is a slight increase. The budget includes $15.7 million in the first year and $16.4 million in the second year for the higher retirement rates for the state plans. And in K-12, there is $32 million the first year and $32.4 million the second year for higher rates for the teacher plan. Slide 106 just shows the current rates and the proposed rates for both the retirement plans and the OPEBs, the health insurance credit, and the group life, and the sickness and disability plan. As you can see, the rates did not shift dramatically. There was a slight uptick in the retirement rates due to the policy change. For the state employee health insurance program, there is $12.7 million in the first year and $53.9 million in the second year. For assumed premium increases, the employee and the employer share will increase. The budget assumes 2.4% increase this coming July and a 6.7% increase in the second year. The budget does not assume any policy changes in the program. In addition to that, there's almost $500,000 for the UVA health plan. It's traditionally when we increase the premiums for the state employee plan, we increase funding for the UVA employees who are in their own separate plan. And there are numerous proposed targeted, there is no across-the-board salary increase for state employees or state-supported local employees in the budget. However, there are targeted salary increases for specific employee groups. In the compensation board, there's an increase of $2.7 million the first year for regional jail officers. This would mirror the increase that the entry-level deputy sheriffs in the sheriff's offices got 2 years ago. At that time, the regional jail officers did not get the same increase in starting pay. There is $1.8 million the first year to increase circuit court clerk salaries to equate them to parity with general district court clerks. There's almost $7 million the first year and $7.9 million the second year for correctional officers. It would increase the starting pay for the entry level 9.6% and then also have a flow through for the higher level, higher ranked correctional officers. In addition to that, there's a Northern Virginia salary differential proposal for one of the offices at the Department of Veteran Services, and there is a recommendation of $9 million GF for the local Department of Social Services. These are local employees to increase their pay to get them up to the national average. Moving to Tony.
Mr. Chairman, capital outlay in the Treasury Board in House Bill 29, there was about $11 million of savings. In House Bill 30, there's about $170 million that has to increase over the biennium for the projects that are proposed, both previously approved projects and the new projects in the introduced budget. In House Bill 29, there was about $109 million in new spending that's listed below. The only one I'll point out is that there's a $51 million supplement at Central State Hospital. You funded that last year. This adds 48 more beds. When they first funded it, they left one of the pods off. This would put those extra beds back online. In House Bill 30, it's about $3.7 billion in new capital that's listed below. As you can see, $2.4 billion of that is in tax-supported bonds, and then the others are listed just below that. I'll go into a little more detail here. This table just gives you a summary of the $3.7 billion. Again, the general fund is for planning. VCBA and VPBA primarily is for new construction, and then David already mentioned the water quality, and some maintenance reserve is in there as well. And there's some supplements for existing projects of about $146 million, and then several of the non-general fund categories. For the proposed bond program itself, the $2.4 billion, as I said, $1.5 billion is for new construction. This includes about $161 million for institution-specific projects in higher education. We'll note that there's about $600 million of these projects are new projects that were not previously approved by the General Assembly for planning, so they're coming in sort of from a different route. There's also funding in there, as you note, as you do every year, for the Equipment Trust Fund for about $166 million. When you put it all together, it will use about 4 years of the projected debt capacity. You have Manju, the treasurer, will be here next week, and she will go over the debt capacity report for you as part of the full meeting. In project planning, so on top of the projects that are there, there's about $21 million to either pre-plan or do detail planning for 14 new projects, and then there's $1.6 million to continue planning for 2 previously approved projects. These projects have an estimated construction value of about $500 million or more. There's also $16 million in non-general fund. That's for 6 new higher education projects. Again, they do the planning and then they get reimbursed. They also have project costs in excess of $500 million. And then the pipeline. So there's $1 billion now of planning projects, plus projects that you previously approved that are ready to go at this point but are not in the budget. There's about another $600 million of those that are in the pipeline. So that would equate to about another 2 years of debt capacity if you were to do those, but $1.6 billion. And the last slide is just a summary of the non-general fund, again, primarily federal and auxiliary, mainly in transportation and everything. The 9C and 9D bonds are all on higher education.
Okay, any questions from the committee? Okay, thank you. 1 second. Just wanted to remind the committee that tomorrow after adjournment, half an hour after adjournment, we'll have our full committee meeting. Thank you. We are adjourned.